everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 27th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, we are now in our, 11th year of the show. What? And we keep this train on the tracks really by relying on the support of listeners just like you. I used to sell a lot of ads on the show. Not only has that sort of dried up, but it's also not something that I want to be spending my time doing. I still do some programmatic ads just to keep it going and to keep the hosting sites happy. But for the most part, each of these shows is paid for by listeners just like you through the Patreon model. And that is how I can continue to pay my I hate calling her my assistant because she's so much more than that. My behind the scenes producer who books every episode, who goes back and forth with all the different publishers and different interviewees to try and get everything squared away. She does all of the back end work for the show. Noelle Dilworth. I could not do this without her. And also my incredible editing team. I've got to pay them to be able to keep this show going as well at Warp Zone Post. And so really, I rely on the support of you just to be able to keep making this show every single week. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can learn about the different tiers and things there. As a huge thank you to the top tier patrons each week. I do give them a shout out on the show. So this week, that includes Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Joseph Lamore, Anu Badavaj, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so much. And thank you to everybody else whose name I don't get to call each week. Otherwise, it would be a really long and boring intro. But I'm just so grateful for your support. All right, let's get to it. It was a fascinating chat today. I'm so glad to have been able to speak with Dr. Anjana Khatwa. She is a geologist, really an earth scientist, and she's also a television presenter and a writer. She's won numerous awards from the Geological Society, from the Geologists Association. She's presented numerous programs for the BBC and other networks. And she has a brand new book, which is actually going to be available on November 4th here in the US. But of course, it's available now for pre-order. And I have myself a copy. So you may be able to get your copy early. We'll see. But it's called The Whispers of Rock, the stories that stone tells about our world and our lives. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Anjana Khatwa. Well, Anjana, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Cara.
I am excited to talk about your new book, The Whispers of Rock, the stories that stone tells about our world and our lives. But even before we talk about your book, as I always do on the show, I want to get to know you a little bit more. I want to get to know your work, your path, kind of how you got to where you are, and also what inspired you to write this book. So, you're an earth scientist, and I think a lot of folks who listen to the show hear from scientists from a lot of different disciplines. I always found that the two fields that most confused me from an academic perspective were sort of like planetary or earth sciences and then astrophysics, cosmology. Because on the one hand, you've got this with astrophysics and cosmology, it's like, is it experimental? Is it theoretical? Do you do math? Do you have a lab? Do you actually measure things? And then over on earth sciences, I have friends who are, like moon scientists who are in astronomy departments who study the earth. And then there's like GIS, and then there's rocks, and then there's paleontology. And it's such a wide kind of ranging field.
It's such a broadly diverse subject, and it covers all of those superficial processes that we see creating the landscape of, the earth itself. And then there's also the subsurface as well. So you're absolutely right. It is a deeply complex subject. And I think, many of the processes that have gone to creating the world that we know around us happen out of sight and out of mind. And
Mm.
that's why I think it's so difficult, I think, to grasp as a subject.
And so, as an earth scientist yourself, I'm curious because I think the UK academic track is a little bit different than it is here in the US. I think you might specialize sooner. Like when you're doing what we would call your undergrad or your what we call college, which is very confusing to people in the UK, but basically a bachelor's level degree. Have you already chosen what you want to study in graduate school? Are you already on that track?
Yes, we are. So the first
Mm.
year of our undergraduate degree is a very broad basis. In my particular case, earth sciences was incredibly broad. It was physical geography and geology. And then as I moved through the system in my second and third years, I started to specialize in sedimentary geology. So by the time I kind of came out of the degree, I had a very, very fine understanding of sedimentary geology, which then led me on to a PhD. So yes, you're absolutely right. We absolutely focus on quite acute subjects at a very
Mm.
specialized level quite early on.
And so by the time you start your PhD, you basically have a research question in mind or maybe a general idea of how you want to focus your research and you don't really take coursework at the graduate level, do you? Is it mostly just research?
Yes, it is. It's a completely theoretically based. You're
Mm.
asking yourself a question at the very start of the graduate process, the PhD process, and then you will spend the next 3 to 4 years conducting a literary search and then an investigation into understanding whatever it is you've set the course on, for you to question about the subject you're working in. And in my particular case, I was really interested in subglacial deformation. So these are very soft, pliable sediments that sit underneath quite large masses of ice. And I was really interested in how they behaved as the ice moved over them. So, yeah, very, very specialized niche subject.
Oh, I love that though. It's interesting because it is, in a lot of ways, it's similar here in the US. There's also this like deep specialization, this, kind of theoretical focus where you dive in early. But for us, because our undergraduate degrees are so wide sweeping and because you have to sort of study a lot of different subjects. You eventually declare a major, but you have to study a lot of different subjects. By the time you start graduate school, let's say you go for a PhD, generally speaking, every program is different. The first 2 years are still pretty full of coursework. You're still getting to know your lab. You're still kind of learning some techniques in the bench or in the field. And you're starting to develop your thesis or your dissertation question. So while we have that 3 to 4 years of really intensive study, it happens after 2 full years of coursework. So most people, I mean, you're lucky if you get out of a PhD in 4 years. Mine took 6. Mine was
Oh,
clinical, so
crikey.
and that's not uncommon. Yeah, but
Wow.
I've known people who were in their labs for 7, 8, and by then their professors are like, "Get out! I'm tired of funding you." But yeah, it can take quite a long time. So that's cool to hear because it sounds like then you sort of you you made these decisions early. You stayed focused. Did you take time off, or did you push straight through and finish your PhD quite young?
I pushed straight through, if I'm honest.
Mm.
And I was one of these rare cohorts in I would say, the mid 90s in the UK, where I got a very good first degree and then was interviewing for PhD straight afterwards. So at that time, moving into a PhD straight from an undergraduate degree was not unusual. You had to really prove yourself and prove your capabilities. And
Mm.
when I then went to the University of Southampton, that's what I did. I went on straight onto my PhD after the undergraduate. But because I think I had specialized so acutely on sedimentary geology and particularly geotechnical, what we call engineering geology, I was able to move into that research space fairly easily and then move through the PhD. I think in the end it took me 3.5 years to complete. So it was a very, very intense process. yeah, I'm not sure if I could handle doing it now again. It was absolutely exhausting, but yeah, it was it's quite an intense fast track process. It's very different now, I have to say. The experiences I hear from graduate students now in the UK is very much more, I would say, aligned to the experiences that US students
Mm.
have. But certainly in those mid 90s, it was a very, I would say, quite a stressful, intense experience.
Sounds like it. And so tell me a little more about this area of focus, sedimentary geology. And you specifically said you were looking at these sort of subglacial processes. So, sediment, right? Is that exactly how it sounds? It's the stuff that gets laid down through, I don't know, erosion, through precipitation, like just over geologic timescales. What is sedimentary geology?
Sedimentary geology is essentially, it's a branch of geology that examines the kind of the evolution and formation of sedimentary rocks, and they come from all sorts of different origins, whether it's laid down by rivers or by ice or even in a desert environment. So sedimentary rocks are essentially composed from the broken particles of other different types of rocks, and they could be from igneous in origin, which are volcanic rocks, or even metamorphic rocks and sedimentary rocks themselves. So sedimentary geology is essentially, also includes, fossils and paleontology as well, because the majority of, organic life is retained and fossilized within sedimentary rocks as well. So it's a vastly diverse subject within itself as well. But I found it deeply fascinating because sedimentary rocks, essentially, they're formed from processes that you can see, happening in the world today. And that magical connection all across deep time, from a river flowing across a valley to, looking at a sedimentary rock where you can see, the flows of a river in flood or in decline. I just thought that was an incredible connection.
Oh, I love that. And so, and you specifically focused on these processes that happened underneath glaciers during what, like these ice ages?
Yes, absolutely. So within the UK, the British Isles were covered, about 10,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum, and a lot of my field sites were in the northern parts of Great Britain, and those ice sheets left behind quite large sequences of sediments. So once those ice sheets retreated, those sediments were left behind, and we can go and look at those sediments and the landforms that those ice sheets created to tell a story about Ice Age Britain. And of course, as geologists, we always look at the contemporary environment as well. So I had a couple of field trips to Iceland as well, and all sorts of other kind of environments like that, where I could see ice interacting with the landscape in real time as well.
Oh, I love that so much. I'm curious how you sort of early on discovered that this was what you wanted to focus on. I know that you describe it a little bit in your book, but tell us a little bit about sort of how you first, I don't know, fell in love with planetary science, and especially with these processes and the evidence that we see today that tells us what was happening on our home rock thousands of years ago, millions of
I,
years ago,
yeah,
really.
I was going to say hundreds of millions of years ago.
Yeah.
It's, I think, anybody that's got interested in geology and rocks in particular, I think you have to have a deep connection with them to spend, well, I've spent much of my professional career, which spans 25 years, investigating and telling their stories. And for me, that moment started in southeastern Kenya at a place called the Shaitani lava flows. Now, both of my parents are from Kenya, and so is much of my extended family. So when I went there as a teenager, 13 years old, I was walking across these incredible lava flows. And the lava flows are there because Kenya is part of the East African Rift Valley system. You've got two plates pulling apart. The crustal rocks in the bottom, are dropping. But what's happening is that the crust is riddled with fissures where lava eruptions are quite common. And as we were traveling from from Nairobi to Mombasa, we stopped off at this really quite extraordinary place. The whole landscape is covered in these really dark, jagged rocks. And I was, as a 13-year-old, walking across these sharp rocks, and I just I was absolutely captivated by how they looked, why they were there. This idea that the landscape was covered in a churning sea of lava, if you like, and
Mm.
that was the moment where I felt that epiphany. I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to study. I want to understand this dynamic world that we live in. And I picked up a rock on that very same day. And bizarrely, there's also a photograph of me as this geeky 13-year-old standing with my family, like those great holiday photographs that are taken, where everybody's just standing there, posing for the camera. So I have this rock I picked up as a 13-year-old. I have this family photograph. And it's just this extraordinary moment in my life captured, which was that turning point that set me on a course to become a geologist.
Oh, I love that so much. So you were born in the UK to Kenyan parents, and you would go back to Kenya to visit family, and that's where that first took place. Did you do most of your studies in the UK? Did you stay home for most of your life?
Yeah, well, when I was an undergraduate student, I went to study in London and kind of lived away from home for a bit, and then moved to the south coast of England where I studied at the University of Southampton. That's where I did my PhD. And then after that, interestingly, I lived in the US for 4 years, traveling
Mm.
around and working with different research scientists and at different universities. And I have to say, that was a real formative experience for me because up until that point, I hadn't really lived overseas. I'd visited overseas, of course, but spending quite considerable time immersed in a different culture in a different country, that was a real making of me. I didn't really see my family very much during those years because we had a bit of a rift because I wanted to choose to study a postdoc in the US, and my parents were like, well, we would like for you to maybe get married and to kind of become a bit more domesticated, and I kind of didn't really want to do that. And so I kind of went to the US as a bit of a break to just see what I could do in my career. And I had the best times. I met the best people. I had the most incredible experiences. And that really set me on a course to work in a kind of career where I told stories about landscapes.
Oh, I love that. Where were you when you were here?
Oh, I traveled quite a fair bit. I started off at the University of Kentucky, and then halfway through that postdoc, I moved to the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I was working with a research scientist at the time, and we were looking at the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet on
Mm.
an NSF funded program. And then after that finished, I then returned back to the UK for a short spell to work for the British Geological Survey, but then came straight back to the US after about 9 months to work at the University of Utah at the Department of Geology and Geophysics as a research scientist, and then spent a considerable number of years at the Department of Geography there working as an adjunct professor. But I was really lucky because at that time I also applied for this little kind of part time position with the US National Park Service, an internship, which is essentially called
Oh.
Geoscientist in the Park. And so I had this incredible opportunity of teaching at the University of Utah, but also spending time with the National Park Service, learning about landscape conservation and communication of science and research that aided conservation of natural environments. And that was the making of me. I just thought, this is what I want to do. I want to work in a career that celebrates and conserves natural landscapes for everybody forever.
Oh, I love that story so much. And I think like you're humbling me right now and reminding me how lucky I am, especially in these very dark times here in the US,
Mm,
to open my eyes and remember how lucky I am to live on a continent that is so incredibly geologically diverse. I mean, you're
mm,
talking about not only teaching in Utah, but also working within the park systems there. I can't think of a more beautiful place. I mean, obviously, the US has, we've got Alaska and we've got Montana and we've got Colorado and we've got Hawaii and here in California, as saw firsthand. But gosh, Utah is gorgeous. It is beautiful. And the amount of geologic diversity there must have been like such a playground.
It really is. And I think when you move into southern Utah and you've got those beautiful landscapes which have got that slick orange sandstone sculpted by the wind, my goodness, it takes your breath away. Some of the most beautiful landscapes I've ever seen and experienced, actually. And I think when you then add on the additional layer of First Nations and ancestral connections to the landscape, and you understand how ancient people have lived in that landscape and interpreted it, it just brings it to life.
Ugh. And I want to talk a little bit about your sort of focus and interest in advocating for sort of diversity and inclusion within these, within science in general, but also within this field of science. But kind of on our way to that, I'd love to ask how you made that turn because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. I too sort of was half in academia and half in public science communication. You've worked in, television, you've been presenting on the BBC for many years. You've done like some radio stuff. Obviously, you've written this book, public speaking. How did you make that turn from I shouldn't say just, but from focusing full time on being sort of a field scientist and professor to bringing your love for geology to the masses?
I've always loved talking to people about what I love, which is geology and landscapes. And this came to the forefront when I came to work for the Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site. So after I completed 4 years in the US, I then came back to the UK to manage the learning and engagement program for the Jurassic Coast, which is a UNESCO
Mm.
World Heritage Site. And when I was working in that job, I had to really step into a completely different geological space because I was communicating and developing learning and engagement resources about a whole different period of geology that I really wasn't used to. So my learning curve was quite steep. And then about a year or two into that job, I was approached by the BBC to appear on a program called Fossil Detectives, which was a series of about 8 programs where me and another team of other presenters went across the country and explored geological stories. And it was that experience that really triggered my passion and interest to go more into kind of on screen experiences to talk about why I love geology so much. And then
Mm.
after my daughter was born, I had this incredible opportunity to apply to the BBC as part of what they call the Women Expert Programme. And I won a place on it. So you had to create a whole bunch of videos and go through an application process. And I was one of 70 women, I think, out of thousands that applied for a place at the BBC Academy. And, we were invited up to London and we were given this amazing training for how to work and develop ourselves as presenters, in factual, specialist factual. And I just came out of that experience just wanting to do more of that. And over a period of about 13 to 15 years, it's quite a challenging industry to break. And I think with
Mhm.
with the content that I talk about, which is geology and landscape, particularly I think in the UK, there isn't quite an appetite for that. There's more of an appetite for programming that talks about the living aspects of nature and especially archaeology, but there isn't so much of an appetite for earth sciences and particularly the work that I do. So what I've ended up doing is channeling my energies into all sorts of other things. So I still appear on television, I still present pieces on programs where they need a geological head, an expert in rocks. Um, and I do a lot of work, appearing on programs like that and presenting really interesting and complex stories from a geological point of view. But I also do a lot on social media. And the book was this kind of amazing opportunity to help people step into this world where I exist. And I just felt like, television programs are amazing, but they're quite transient, aren't they? They're kind of there.
Mhm.
But the book, my words, my thoughts, my feelings, I felt like if I could put those onto a page, they're there forever, aren't they? And that was an absolute privilege to step into that world and do that.
Oh, I love that. And so when did you first decide that you were gonna because it's I say this to every author, especially scientist slash author, who comes on the show, that is a huge undertaking. And I know that personally because I have yet to do it. I have
Oh, you should
wanted
do
to
it.
for many years. I mean, and I have, I've got the editor and I've got the, the support and everything. I've got the agent and everybody really saying, let's do it. And I'm like, oh my God, it's so daunting. It's so overwhelming. I'm curious, when did you first make the decision to do it, and how long, what kind of a labor of love was this for you?
Well, I decided it was round about, I think, 2021, and I'd got to the point where I had done lots of things on TV and appearing in different programs and talking about geology. But for me, I just couldn't seem to crack the barrier facing me, which was, we love what you do, Anjana. We love your passion and your joy for this subject, but we don't really understand it. And this is what was coming from production
Mm.
companies. So I said to my media agent at the time, I said, what I need to do is I need to write a book, because if I can put all of my thoughts into a book, hopefully a production company will read that and then see what I can see, what I love. And so the process started in September 2021, where I saw this amazing opportunity to enter a nature writing competition called the Nan Shepherd Prize. And I wrote a proposal and I wrote a sample chapter, and the original book was called The Rock Whisperer. And the story was part memoir and part, kind of exploration of the science of geology and how different people tell stories about rock and landscape. And I entered that into this nature writing competition and was longlisted. And that
Ooh.
got me the attention of a literary agent. And he and I met in January 2022. He loved the book. And then we spent the next 9 months working on a new proposal. So we shifted the narrative slightly of my original idea. We turned it kind of slightly away from memoir and more into a kind of popular science nature book, so that actually the main protagonist of the story are the rocks rather than myself. And although I am there as a narrator, and part of my life experiences are in the book, what the book really focuses on is the story of the rock itself. And that process took 9 months, and it was weekends because I had a job working in a partnership of about 6 museums as an engagement lead. And I do work in inclusion and diversity. So that was quite a heavy going job, four
Yeah.
days a week. And then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I would just write the proposal. And my agent was absolutely amazing. He has a real specialism of working with new writers. And he held my hand through the whole process and really gave me key guidance about what would be commercially viable in terms of all of the knowledge that I had in my head. And by the end of the process, when we got to September and it was ready to go out for sale, the proposal was enormous. And the undertaking was huge. It was 40,000 words. That's like
Wow.
half of the final book, right? But the proposal was so detailed. I'd meticulously researched all of the stories that I wanted to put in, and I'd kind of identified the people that I'd wanted to speak to, and the case studies that I wanted to pin the chapters to. So I had a very, very tight layout. And when it went out for sale and it was eventually bought by Basic Books in the US and Little Brown in the UK, one of the key pieces of feedback to me from the commissioning editor was the proposal was so detailed. It was so um, vast in terms of its
Mhm.
content that's why it secured the six-figure sum that it was eventually bought for, which was astonishing. I almost fell off my chair
Oh,
when I saw that come in. Yeah,
amazing.
a six-figure sum for my debut nonfiction. But the reason why they bought it was they had enormous trust and belief that I was the real deal, that I was going to deliver a book that would literally reshape how the reader would feel about geology, because the proposal had so much in it. And then the writing process begins, because obviously the whole amazement of achieving such an incredible advance then kind of put me into a huge kind of state of pressure and
Mhm.
anxiety, because you know you have to deliver, don't you? You have to deliver on the promise. And the book, I had already told the publisher I need 2 years to research and write a book of such epic proportions. And then I gave up my museum's job. So about kind of 4 months into writing the book, I said to the museums, look, I'm going to have to step away from this wonderful job you've given me. And then I was able to work full time on the book. But that required an immense sacrifice on part of my family and my friends, and also myself, because what you're doing when you have such an immense task to write a book with such an epic scale is you do have to hide yourself away. And my children, I mean, this was like 2 years ago, so my daughter was still quite young, and she was, what was she, how old was she was 12 years old. So
Hmm.
and my two stepsons were a bit older, but my husband, he was just so understanding, and he picked up the parenting that I couldn't do. I couldn't spend time with them at the weekends because I was writing, and then I had to go off for field work, and so I was relying on my husband a lot to pick up the love and the support for the children that I wasn't emotionally able to give them, because all of those emotions I had to save them and put into the words that eventually became this book. And so I
Hmm.
think that's what you don't see behind the scenes. There's a lot
Yeah.
of sacrifice, there's a lot of emotion and anxiety and exhaustion, but also a lot of self-doubt, because with a book like this that blends together spirituality and science, the anxiety I felt going through that process, I did wonder whether this was going to be a career ending book. Who
Mm.
wants to welcome a book that blends together different ways of knowing about our world? And I kind of thought to myself, geology is such a complex and abstract subject. Am I really ending my career by blending these different knowledge systems together? And that anxiety carried through, even I would say up until the launch of the UK edition. But now I know what the reception to the book has been, and I know that I did the right thing. I'm really proud of the book.
Oh, I love that so much. And I think that there's this sort of deep parallel between something that I pointed to earlier, which is, diversity and inclusion within the STEM fields, and this blending, as you mentioned, of what we think of, which is such a silly, even moniker, but as like sort of traditional, which is actually very like Western approaches to science, and or people call it classic or traditional, but it's really not. It's quite new. But these approaches to science and these deeply kind of important and personal spiritual connections to the work. So I'd love to maybe talk about that for a little while. I mean, obviously, we can get into some of the technical components of the book, how it's laid out, and some of the topics that you cover. But I also often, when I have authors on the show, I'm not interested in just restate, like, I don't want an abridged
Mm.
version of the book on the podcast. People can read the book. That's the point. I want to whet their appetite, right, for what's in there. So I'd love to hear a little more about how you dug into this personal approach, and how that parallels with the advocacy that you do for, towards sort of inclusion and diversity. Because obviously there is a big parallel there.
Yeah, there is. And inclusion and diversity is something that has been a really golden thread that's woven through my professional career as a woman of color and working in a very male dominated field for the last, 25 years. I've had to, by necessity, work as a champion for DEI in the spaces where I've been. Quite often in protected landscapes, and particularly in conservation, in geological conservation, there are, I cannot tell you over the last 20 years where I've only been the brown face in the room. And that in itself presents quite a challenge, because you're
Mm.
challenging a specific narrative that people are presenting about what the natural world means, how others should engage with it, and especially how it should be conserved and looked after. And when I was writing this book, I wanted to bring the voices of those communities right to the forefront. So, inclusion and diversity within the book is a very strong narrative. And I think, particularly with geological sciences, we have done, as a scientific community, we haven't done enough to embrace diverse perspectives on how people value and understand the creation and evolution of natural landscapes. And by bringing those voices to the forefront within the book itself, so what readers will notice is that a lot of my contributors do come from indigenous backgrounds, or they are women. And it was really important to me to platform those voices so that we begin to reframe not just our understanding of the geological world, but also our appreciation of who it is that contributes to these knowledge systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And so tell me a little bit about your own sort of personal, you mentioned your own obviously your identification, but when it comes to that sort of intersectionality, how did spirituality find its way? And I'm super curious about this as and people who listen to the show know this as an atheist, like a pretty staunch atheist, but who I work as a psychologist now, after multiple career changes, as a clinical psychologist in a cancer center. And I often specialize in people with very severe illness and also people who are at end of life. And so as an atheist, I work directly with people
Mm.
for whom spirituality and their own personal perspective on religion or, however they want to define it is central to the work that we do. And I just think having that plurality of positions and viewpoints is so important. And so I'm curious about your own personal, or I don't know how much you're comfortable talking about, but your own personal connection and how that kind of weaves itself into the narrative.
I'm very comfortable talking about this because I have been on a journey myself in writing this book. When I started off, I think I was very much looking at the spiritual aspects of the narratives that I was going to weave in from a distance because I'd
Mm,
existed in quite a neutral space for so long to survive in my career as a scientist. I always had to keep the other half of myself, the other half of my identity as a South Asian Hindu woman to, almost behind a barrier because science itself requires you to be at a distance as you're conducting that work. You're an observer, you have to evaluate, you have to be objective. And in order to understand and reflect upon my communications and engagement with Indigenous peoples, I had to move myself into a middle ground. And the more time I spent talking to and consulting with Indigenous peoples from all over the world, plus my community within the UK, I found myself changing through the process. It was quite an extraordinary moment where I rediscovered my own spirituality. And there were a couple of key people that helped me along the way. Firstly, my mother is such an extraordinary woman. She gently took me on a journey over the 2 years that I was writing a book to kind of guide me into a sense of understanding how nature is alive within me and all around me. And
mm.
just by her conversations, I just began to feel such a greater connection to sensing the animacy in the world around me again. I'd always felt that growing up, but for some reason, it just kind of was subdued as I'd kind of pursued my scientific career. But those moments with my mother, I'd walk with her, I'd be with her at home, I'd listen to her stories, even about her own childhood, and it just sparked inside me this sense of an animacy in nature and particularly in geology. And then there were a couple of groups that I spoke to from different communities across the world, especially Maori communities in Te Waiponamu, Aotearoa in New Zealand. And my engagements with them were so profound. There were moments where I just found myself, I couldn't believe how we felt the same about nature and rocks and landscapes, even though we were thousands of miles apart and our cultures were vastly different. And it was this alliance of thinking and emotion that just helped me to move into a space where I was able to write with genuine respect and authenticity about the stories that I was uncovering and kind of bringing to the reader with a sense of empathy and humility.
Oh, I love that so much. I'm curious, has that process, of sort of rediscovering yourself, of being so inspired by your mother, by these other cultures and your travels and your research, has it had a lasting impact on your own self-identity, on like sort of how you're raising your children, how you're engaging with public science communication, but also with yourself?
Yes, it's had a profound impact on me. I mean, my daughter, she's 14 now, and the book is dedicated to her. and she's been dragged out to every single scientific event that I've ever done. It's not hard to imagine, is it, when you become a single parent to a 6 month old baby. She had to come with me to all of these things that I was doing in my career, because I wasn't I, I'd worked so hard for it. I wasn't going to let single motherhood stop me from still achieving the ambitions that I'd set out when I was a 13-year-old walking over those lava flows. And I think my mother, myself, and my daughter, we are like a trinity of individuals. And all the learning that my mother has given to me, I'm passing on to my daughter. And my daughter has an immense love and respect for science, a slightly different science, not earth sciences. She's a bit like you. She's really into biological sciences
Mm.
and medicine and understanding how the human body functions. So it's slightly different, but she still has a love and an interest and a curiosity for the scientific world. And just that kind of sense of building a community around me that supports me on this journey, my family, my friends. Yeah, it's kind of been the making of me, if you like.
Oh, I love that so much. And what a wonderful, I mean, you've mentioned that you've had this very rich career. So obviously you're not, you're not in your 20s anymore. And so what a wonderful thing to be able to identify that this is the making of you at this stage in your life. I think it's so inspiring I just turned 42 2 days ago as of this recording, and
Well,
every
happy
new
birthday.
birthday. Thank you so much. But every new birthday is very bittersweet at this point. And so I just love hearing stories about people who are in this middle part of their life,
Mm.
reinventing themselves, finding themselves in a lot of ways, whether it's for the first time or they're rediscovering something that they always knew what was in them. It's such a beautiful thing to hear about folks having these deep, I think, personal journeys, at any point in their life.
I think at any point in your life, and what's funny is this is the year that I turned 50, and
Oh,
that's
well,
quite
happy birthday to you.
thank you. It's quite a monumental shift in your life when you turn 50, because
Mm.
obviously 50 is quite it's quite a landmark, but also your whole body and your physiology is changing. You're going through perimenopause, and I'm going through that process at the moment. And then to be in a position where my debut nonfiction is coming out. It's this culmination of my life experiences of working as a geologist, and also as a woman in science, having really, now I feel I'm at the peak of my game now, my professional game. And I just feel like, let's celebrate getting older, because it is, we I have so much to offer to others coming up in the wings, and I just want
Mhm.
their journeys to be easier than mine. And that is what I advocate for. I do this in everything, all the work that I do for diversity and inclusion. I just want to make the process easier for those that are coming up behind me, because goodness knows I'm not going to be here forever. But I want others that are coming up to kind of be able to convey the love and the passion they have for the natural world, and particularly the geological world, after I'm long gone.
I love that so much. And I'm so, curious. There's a million other things I could ask you, but I also don't want to keep you all morning. So, actually, it's evening for you, morning for me. But one of the things that has been sort of nagging at me, and we don't have to get into any personal political views, and we don't have to get into any sort of technical, differences between politics in the US or the UK. But I think it's easy to say that here in the US, but also infecting the rest of the world, there is a shift towards a more authoritarian view, a more anti science view. There's a fear of a new Lysenkoism, there's a fear of suppression. Like even just saying things like diversity, equity, and inclusion is, not only are we kind of fearful around it because it's looked down upon by our current administration. It's actually being in some ways kind of like criminalized by our administration. So given all of these pressures, given your family's diverse background, the things that they have been through in the different places that they have lived, I'm just curious how you maintain hope in sort of this
Mm.
difficult time. You're doing such a brave and important thing at a time when we never expected that we would be in a new era of pressure against celebrating diversity, right? I think
Mm.
all of us sort of felt like we were on this bending towards justice, right? That moral arc of the universe was bending in a very obvious direction. And in many ways, it feels like we've hit a large roadblock. So, all that's to say, I'll stop talking because I want to hear your
Yeah.
perspective on where we are right now, how we continue this journey, and where you find sort of hope against some of the days that might be breeding a bit of like cynicism or just difficulty.
I find hope in the fact that there are more of us that believe in unity and justice and equity for everybody than there are of those that don't. And I see this because in my day job, I work as the head of inclusion and belonging for the National Trust, which is the largest conservation charity in Europe. And I share this role with my job share colleague. So I work 3 days a week delivering diversity and inclusion for this wonderful, passionate organisation that looks after special places of nature, beauty, and history across the British Isles. And that job gives me hope because we have a staff population of 12,000 people, we have 40,000 volunteers, and one of our core missions and our core strategy is how do we build a society that is equitable and welcomes everybody into our special places. And so I live and breathe this in my professional life. Now, in my other life as an earth scientist, I really have hope because I believe that people genuinely, they love nature, they love the natural world, and they do love each other at some level. And I know that it's very difficult, particularly in the UK at this time where there is quite strong division between the left and the right. But
Mm.
what I see is that there are more of us calling for unity and empathy with people that are struggling in life, particularly those that are fleeing from countries where they've experienced war and terror, and they are coming to our shores seeking help. And I do believe that the rhetoric that is being shared about, and words are used like invasion and migrants and fear, there are more of us that are now challenging that openly. And I really do believe that when I meet people like this and I hear what they have to say, whether I'm at work or whether I'm, talking to others or reading or seeing things on social media, there is a counter effort to balance the hate that is being spread and the lies that are being spread by others. And that's what gives me hope. And I think because I work in the geological field, I kind of know that there is a cyclicity to these moments in social systems. We will come through this. And I think the geological
Mhm.
world tells us this because, everything is a cycle. The rock cycle is essentially a process that teaches us that without destruction, there cannot be creation, and vice versa. And I do believe that these cycles of the rise of particular types of attitudes, they come and go, but there is a balance to everything, and we will eventually get ourselves back into a position of balance, because I don't think we can completely eradicate one point of view over the other, but I think as long as we have a balance between the two, an equilibrium that we can exist in, then I think that is what success looks like to me. That is what a good society looks like to me.
Ugh, I agree wholeheartedly. And I'm just so grateful for the work that you do, for the effort that you put into this beautiful book, for the time that you shared with us today. And my hope is that folks who are listening to the show will be inspired to pick up the Whispers of Rock and not only learn more about our natural history, learn more about this kind of rock that we all share and that we call home, and all of the different processes and changes that have occurred on it over geologic time, but also interrogate a little bit their own relationship with nature, their own relationship with their place in, kind of the great beyond, the same way that you have personally. It's such an inspiring story. The prose is so beautiful, and it's been such a joy to converse with you today.
Oh, thank you, Cara. Your words mean so much to me. I can't tell you. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.